It started on a Tuesday. If you think about it, Tuesdays are the most insulting day of the week to have your life unravel. Not a dramatic Friday, not a moody Sunday. A Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee, exhausted from back-to-back client calls. Rachel leaned against the counter wearing that specific honey-dipped smile she reserved for when she wanted something. "Peter," she said, her voice impossibly warm. "Klaus wants to take us to dinner on Friday. He says he wants to get to know the man behind the woman." Klaus Brainer, her boss, the senior managing director of Brainer Vice Capital. I looked up from my laptop, met her eyes, and smiled. "Sure," I said. "Sounds great." I meant exactly none of it, because I already knew my wife was sleeping with him, and I already knew exactly who Klaus Brenner was. To understand why this didn't just break me, you have to understand what Rachel and I used to be. We weren't a high society power couple. We were a standard middle-class American cliché, and for a long time, I loved every second of it. We shared a starter home in the suburbs with a furnace that made a weird clanking noise in the winter. We ate cheap pad thai on the living room floor on Friday nights and argued over who had to take the trash out in the rain. It was real. But then came her promotion at Brenner Vice. The shift didn't happen overnight. You lose a marriage the same way you lose daylight in November. So, gradually, you don't notice until it's completely dark. First, it was the late nights. Then came the sudden obsession with appearances, designer bags that cost more than our mortgage payment, subtle complaints about my lack of ambition, and the heavy silences that started filling the spaces where our laughter used to be. She was trading our actual life for the illusion of a better one. But the real story, the reason I could sit at that kitchen island and smile back at a woman actively destroying our life, started 8 months earlier in a hospital room in rural Ohio. I grew up in the kind of town where everybody knows your business, but nobody knows your father's name. My mother, Carol Vance, raised me entirely alone. She worked night shifts at a nursing home and day shifts at a diner, yet somehow always had the energy to quiz me on vocabulary words while she ironed her uniforms. She was the smartest, toughest woman I've ever known, and she never spoke a word about my father until her heart was finally giving out. I was 31, sitting by her hospital bed, listening to the indifferent beep of the monitors. She looked at me with eyes that were terrifyingly lucid. "Peter," she whispered, "there are things I need to tell you about Gerald." Gerald Brenner, a visiting economics lecturer at her university decades ago. A man from immense generational wealth who gave her a one-way bus ticket to Ohio the moment she got pregnant and threatened to destroy her if she ever reached out. "Why now, Mom?" I had asked her, my voice shaking. She told me Gerald had suffered a minor heart attack 18 months prior. The sudden brush with mortality had rattled him enough to hire a private investigator to track us down. Then, 14 months ago, the real death sentence came, stage 4, prostate cancer. Time was running out, and Gerald was desperately trying to rewrite his will to include the son he threw away. "He has a legitimate son, Peter," my mother said, her grip tightening weakly around my fingers. "Named Klaus. He runs the family business. I'm telling you this not so you can go looking for trouble. I'm telling you so that when trouble comes looking for you, you'll know exactly what cards you're holding." She passed away 4 days later. After we buried my mother, I did the only thing I knew how to do to keep from falling apart. I went back to work. I am, professionally speaking, a forensic financial analyst. When people hear that, they usually picture some kind of corporate James Bond, hacking into mainframes while a timer ticks down to 0. The reality is much quieter and honestly requires a lot more coffee. Forensic accounting is mostly just patience. It's the art of pulling a thread and sitting perfectly still while the knot slowly unravels. People lie, companies lie, but money always tells the absolute truth. You just have to know how to listen to it. Since my mother had handed me the ultimate thread, I started pulling. I began looking into Brenner Weiss Capital, initially just to understand the ghost of the father I never knew. But when you start digging into a family empire, you inevitably hit the son who runs it. I started in Delaware, which is a wonderful place if you want to hide exactly who owns what. I pulled public LLC filings, looking for the tiny, seemingly insignificant holding companies that executives use to move personal money. I cross-referenced those with Cayman Island shell entities, hunting for overlapping board members or matching registered agent addresses. It took weeks of late nights at the kitchen table, while Rachel slept in the other room. But eventually, I found the digital footprints. Server IP addresses linked directly back to Klaus's private floor at Brenner Weiss. What the money told me was fascinating. Klaus Brenner, the silver-haired wunderkind, the man whose bespoke suits cost more than my car, was a complete fraud. He wasn't a brilliant businessman. He was a desperate man playing a high-stakes shell game. He had been bleeding his own funds dry to cover massive losses. Worse, he wasn't the only one who noticed. Buried deep in a labyrinth of sealed legal motions, I found the quiet, terrifying rumble of an active SEC probe. They were investigating Klaus for fraudulent misrepresentation of fund performance to institutional investors. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and right there, sitting alone in the glow of my laptop at 3 a.m, the ugliest puzzle piece of all finally snapped into place. I had spent months quietly agonizing over why a billionaire playboy CEO would suddenly take such a predatory interest in Rachel. She was beautiful, yes, but men like Klaus operated in a different stratosphere. Billionaires don't just trip and fall into affairs with mid-level managers. It wasn't a coincidence. Klaus had found out about his dying father's changing will. He knew the old man was looking for his illegitimate son in Ohio. He knew exactly who I was. Klaus didn't just target Rachel for romance. He targeted her to get to me. He was facing federal prison and the loss of his inheritance, and he suddenly discovered he had a half-brother with a spotless, unassailable reputation as a forensic financial auditor. I was the perfect insurance policy. By seducing my wife, Klaus was trying to pull me firmly into his orbit, keeping me blind and compromised, hoping to either neutralize me as a rival heir or use my pristine credentials as a human shield when the SEC finally came knocking. I closed my laptop and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. The profound humiliation of being the cheated-on husband evaporated in an instant, replaced by something entirely different. A cold, absolute clarity. I wasn't just a cuckolded husband losing his marriage. I was the target of a corporate conspiracy, and Klaus Brenner had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was playing a game with an ignorant Midwestern accountant, not realizing he had just invited the wolf directly into his own house. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living a double life in your own home. For 6 agonizing months between my mother's funeral and that infamous Tuesday in the kitchen, I became a ghost haunting my own marriage. You don't know what psychological warfare is until you've stood at a coffee maker at 6 a.m, listening to your wife hum a happy little tune, knowing she spent the previous evening in a hotel room with your half-brother. I poured her coffee. I asked her how her big project at work was going. I smiled when she complained about her demanding boss. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to throw the mug at the wall, to confront her, to blow the whole thing up right then and there, but I didn't. Forensic accounting had taught me the value of letting an opponent build their own trap. My first face-to-face encounter with Klaus happened 4 months into this quiet nightmare at the Brenner Weiss holiday party. It was held at a downtown hotel ballroom dripping in forced corporate opulence. Rachel introduced us near the ice sculpture, her smile a little too tight, her voice a little too high. "Peter, this is Klaus. Klaus, my husband. Peter." He extended his hand. He was tall, impeccably groomed, radiating the kind of effortless entitlement you can only buy. "Peter," he said, his German accent carefully sanded down. "I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," I replied, pumping his hand with just the right amount of aw shucks Midwestern enthusiasm. I played the part perfectly. I was the bumbling, slightly boring, deeply grateful husband, thrilled just to be allowed in the room. Klaus's eyes washed over me with patronizing relief. He bought the act entirely. But I wasn't just there to play the fool. Later that evening, while Klaus was holding court by the bar and Rachel was busy networking, I slipped away to the business center off the main lobby. Brenner Weiss had rented the entire floor, and a company laptop had been left open on a registration desk, used earlier for printing name tags. It took me less than 90 seconds to slip a tiny USB drive into the port and scrape the basic internal corporate directory files. It wasn't the nuclear codes, but it gave me the internal email structures, the direct lines to Klaus's legal fixers, and the names of the compliance officers he was actively dodging. I returned to the party, grabbed a glass of cheap champagne, and spent the rest of the night watching my wife laugh at Klaus's jokes. The hardest part, the detail that nearly broke my resolve, came a few weeks later. I noticed Rachel had started taking a new vitamin. She was careful about it, hiding the distinctive pink pills in an old, generic supplement bottle at the back of the medicine cabinet. A quick cross-reference of our joint credit card statements showed a strange, unitemized copay to a clinic across town. A clinic that, when I looked it up, specialized in obstetrics. Rachel and I had barely touched each other in 2 months. The math was brutal, and it was absolute. She was pregnant. I sat on the edge of our bathtub holding the generic bottle, the pink pills rattling slightly in my shaking hand. I knew instantly what was happening. She was pregnant, and she was letting Klaus believe the child was his. Whether it actually was his or mine didn't matter in her calculus. The baby was just another piece on their board. She was securing her future with a billionaire, and I was just the convenient idiot standing in the way. I put the bottle exactly back where I found it, making sure the label faced the precise angle she had left it. I walked out of the bathroom, went into the kitchen, and asked her what she wanted for dinner. I had all the pieces now, the money, the SEC, the affair, the baby. I just needed the right moment to arrange them. Which brings us back to that Tuesday, and Rachel's honey-dipped invitation to dinner. I didn't just agree to go, I had been waiting for it. And Friday night arrived dressed like it had somewhere important to be. The restaurant was a high-end Chicago steakhouse, dark wood paneling, heavy silver cutlery, and the kind of aggressive, low lighting that tells you immediately they don't print prices on the menu. Klaus was already seated at a corner booth when we arrived. The power dynamic in the room was palpable before we even ordered drinks. Klaus sat perfectly relaxed, playing the magnanimous king holding court. Rachel slid into the booth opposite him, radiating the nervous, preening energy of a queen in waiting. I sat beside her, the designated court jester, wearing my best harmless smile. The conversation flowed exactly the way it does when two people are performing for a third. Lots of warm laughter, lots of careful avoidance of anything real. I ate my dry-aged ribeye. I asked Klaus polite, mundane questions about the bond market. I refilled Rachel's water glass. I watched them exchange fleeting, knowing glances. And then, right between the clearing of the entrees and the arrival of the dessert menus, Rachel made her move. She rested her hand over her stomach. It was a delicate, intentional gesture. Klaus's eyes darted to her hand, a flicker of something possessive passing over his face. Rachel looked at me, gave me a dazzling, practiced smile, and then turned to Klaus. In flawless, rapid German, assuming I was nothing more than an ignorant Midwestern accountant whose cultural bandwidth ended at the state line, she said, "Don't worry. The idiot is so happy about the pregnancy. He thinks it's his. He'll raise your son without ever knowing." She laughed softly. Klaus exhaled, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch in relief. I let the silence stretch. I picked up my wine glass, swirled the dark red liquid slowly, and took a deliberate sip. I counted to exactly 11 in my head. I let the smugness settle deep into their bones. Then I set the glass down, leaned forward, and looked directly into Klaus's eyes. In perfect, unhurried German, I said, "Your father says, 'Hello, Klaus.'" The color drained from Klaus's face so violently, I thought he might actually pass out. Rachel's hand froze on her stomach. Her breath hitched, catching audibly in her throat. I didn't stop there. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, and slid it across the heavy linen tablecloth. It wasn't just a threat. It was proof. It was a printed organizational chart of Klaus's illegal Delaware shell companies, connecting directly back to his personal accounts. "I prefer English from here on out, if you don't mind," I said pleasantly, my voice never rising above a conversational murmur. Rachel was looking at me like the floor had just vanished. Her face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally a terrifying, suffocating panic. The realization was crashing over her in real time. She hadn't outsmarted anyone. She had thrown away a husband who actually loved her for a billionaire who was only using her as a pawn in a family war she knew nothing about. "Peter," she whispered, her voice cracking. I turned to her, my expression entirely hollow. "I found the prenatal vitamins weeks ago, Rachel, hidden in the magnesium bottle. Clever, but not clever enough. Whatever game you two are playing with this baby, it ends tonight." I turned my attention back to Klaus, who was staring at the org chart as if it were a live grenade. He tried to compose himself, his jaw tightening as he reached for the arrogance that had protected him his whole life. "What is this?" Klaus demanded, his voice low, trying to sound authoritative but failing entirely. "That," I said, "is your ruin. You thought you could use Rachel to keep an eye on me. You thought you could use my pristine accounting credentials to shield you when the SEC finally came knocking for the fraudulent fund performance reports you've been filing for the last 18 months. Klaus flinched. Actually flinched. "I know about the investigation, Klaus. I know about the offshore bleeding. And I know Gerald amended the will." I leaned back against the leather booth. "You thought you were playing chess with an idiot, but I'm not playing chess. I'm just here to clear the board." Rachel was openly weeping now, quiet, gasping sobs into her napkin, but I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes locked on the silver-haired wunderkind who suddenly looked very, very old. "I want a meeting with Gerald," I said. That's impossible, Klaus stammered, desperation bleeding into his tone. He's heavily guarded. You can't just... I don't think you understand the position you're in, I interrupted, casually dropping the names of the 2 lead SEC investigators assigned to his file. You have until Monday to arrange the meeting. If I don't see my father, this chart, along with a heavily documented hard drive, goes directly to them. Shall we order dessert? Or do you have a sudden urge to be anywhere else? You would think, after a dinner like that, the fight would simply drain out of a man. But billionaires don't become billionaires by conceding the moment they're outmaneuvered. They escalate. They send their monsters to do the fighting for them. The knock on my door came the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the same spot where Rachel had stood on Tuesday, nursing a black coffee. Rachel hadn't come home last night. I didn't ask where she went, and I didn't care. When I opened the front door, I wasn't greeted by Klaus, but by a man who looked like an expensive, custom-tailored shark. "Mr. Vance," he said smoothly, handing me a heavy, cream-colored business card. "I'm Arthur Vance. No relation, I assure you. I represent Klaus Brenner and the executive board of Brenner Weiss Capital." I didn't invite him in. I just leaned against the door frame. "Arthur, you're out early on a Saturday. Did Klaus forget his checkbook at the restaurant?" Arthur offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "My client is willing to be exceptionally generous regarding the misunderstandings between you and your wife. We have prepared a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. In exchange for your signature and the surrender of whatever digital files you mistakenly believe you possess, you will receive a wire transfer of $2 million. He paused, letting the number hang in the crisp morning air. "If you refuse, my firm is prepared to file a defamation suit by noon on Monday that will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. We will bankrupt you, Peter. It's nothing personal. It's just gravity." He tried to hand me the papers. I didn't take them. "Arthur," I said, taking a sip of my coffee, "you're a senior partner at Whitfield and Associates. You specialize in corporate crisis management. You're very good at scaring people who don't know how the rules work." I set my coffee down on the hall table, stepped past him, and pulled a slim manila folder from my own briefcase resting near the door. I handed it to him. "I don't think Klaus gave you the full picture," I said softly. "I'm not a disgruntled husband looking for a payout. I am a certified fraud examiner and a licensed forensic financial analyst. Under federal law, I am a mandatory reporter for systemic financial crimes." Arthur frowned, opening the folder. Inside was a heavily redacted 10-page summary of my findings. Dates, routing numbers, and the specific regulatory codes Klaus had violated. "If you sue me for defamation," I continued, my voice steady, "you open the door to legal discovery. Every theory I have becomes evidence. Every file I've compiled gets subpoenaed into public record. You won't be burying me in litigation. You will be handing the SEC the exact shovel they need to bury your client." Arthur stopped reading. His eyes flicked up to mine, the practiced arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating realization of a lawyer who knows he just walked into an ambush. "Tell Klaus," I said, stepping back inside my house, "that the price of my silence isn't $2 million. The price is a room number at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He has until tomorrow." I closed the door. I didn't even make it to the kitchen before my phone rang. The caller ID flashed a German country code. "Klaus, I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Room 412. Klaus's voice sounded hollow, stripped of all its former power. The fight was completely gone. I'll leave your name at the nurse's station for tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, I said, and hung up. I stood in the quiet of my empty house, the weight of the last 8 months finally lifting off my chest, making room for the truth I was about to hear. Sunday arrived with the kind of heavy, gray Chicago sky that feels like it's pressing the breath right out of the city. Northwestern Memorial is a hospital that tries desperately not to feel like one. Soft lighting, muted art, hushed corridors, but you can't mask the scent of antiseptic and fading time. I gave my name at the nurse's station on the 4th floor. A young nurse in blue scrubs nodded, her eyes lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long, as if trying to piece together the sudden family resemblance in a room that had only ever seen one son. She led me down the hall and stopped at room 412. "He's having a good day," she murmured, a gentle warning not to expect too much. "But don't stay too long." I pushed the door open. Gerald Brenner was smaller than the ghost I had chased for the last 8 months. In my mind, he had been a towering, formidable titan, the man who broke my mother's heart, the architect of a financial empire. But the man in the bed was just an old, fragile human being. His white hair was thin, and his hands rested on the blankets with the terrifying stillness of someone who knows the end is very near. An IV line snaked into his frail arm. But his eyes were a sharp, piercing blue. They locked onto mine the second I stepped into the room, and in them I saw an intelligence that illness hadn't managed to touch. "You have her jaw," he rasped, his voice rough but entirely steady. I stood at the foot of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. All the anger I thought I would feel had already burned out, leaving only a profound, quiet curiosity. "And you have my mother's stubbornness, apparently," I replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Sit down, Peter." I pulled a chair to his bedside. We didn't start with apologies, and we didn't start with excuses. We started with the only thing that mattered. He told me about the spring semester of 1991. He told me about a fierce, brilliant young woman who stood up in his lecture hall and dismantled his entire thesis on Keynesian economics without breaking a sweat. He told me he had loved her, and he told me exactly how much of a coward he had been when the reality of his family's expectations collided with that love. "I have been a man of immense privilege my entire life," Gerald said, looking at the ceiling, "and I have used it to make an astonishing number of poor choices." "Why now?" I asked. "Why look for us after 30 years? Gerald turned his head toward me. "Because I was dying, and I realized my legacy was entirely hollow. Klaus is—" He paused, searching for the word. "Klaus is exactly the son I raised him to be. Ruthless, entitled. He understands the mechanics of wealth, but he doesn't understand the value of it." He reached a trembling hand toward the bedside table and pushed a thick, sealed manila envelope toward me. "I know about the SEC investigation," Gerald said quietly. "I know Klaus has been bleeding the firm. He thought he was hiding it from me, but I have my own auditors." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "If you knew, why didn't you stop him?" "Because I needed to see what he would do when cornered," Gerald replied. "And what he did was try to neutralize you. He found out about the private investigators I hired to find your mother. He found out about you. I didn't know he had targeted your wife until my lawyers informed me of the connection." Gerald's eyes softened, carrying a heavy, undeniable grief. I am deeply sorry for what he brought into your home, Peter, but you dismantled him. You cornered a billionaire and his legal team without a dime of my money. You used your own mind, your mother's mind." He tapped the envelope. "This is not a check. It is a legally binding affidavit, witnessed by my attorneys, acknowledging you as my biological son. It also outlines the new structure of my estate. Klaus retains operational control of the firm, but his shares are now locked in a trust contingent entirely on regulatory compliance and SEC clearance. If he steps out of line again, the board removes him." I stared at the heavy paper. "You're putting him in a cage." "I'm saving him from federal prison," Gerald corrected gently. "And I am giving you the truth. You don't have to take the Brainer name. You don't have to take the money I've set aside for you. But I needed you to know that you are recognized. You are real." I stayed for another hour. We talked about my mother, about Ohio, about the quiet life I had built. When I finally stood up to leave, I took the envelope. I looked back at the frail man in the bed, the father I had never known, and would barely get the chance to. "Thank you," I said. Gerald closed his eyes, a profound peace settling over his tired face. "Goodbye, son." Gerald Brenner passed away on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after our meeting. It seems Tuesdays are simply the days the universe chooses to pivot the axis of my life. I didn't attend the massive public funeral downtown. I drove out to the lake, sat on the hood of my car in the freezing wind, and drank a thermos of coffee in quiet respect for a man who finally, at the very end, chose to do the right thing. The fallout from that month was swift, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted by the people who thought they were holding all the cards. With Gerald gone and the new will executed, Klaus's reality fractured. Tied to the strict regulatory compliance of his father's trust and terrified of the dossier I held, he had no choice but to voluntarily surrender to the SEC. He didn't go to federal prison. Billionaires rarely do. But he was subjected to crushing fines, publicly ousted as CEO, and permanently sidelined from the company his last name was built on. He became a prisoner of his own inherited wealth, living in a gilded cage he could never escape. When the SEC probe became public, Klaus did exactly what men like him always do when a ship is sinking. He threw the heaviest cargo overboard. He severed all ties with Rachel immediately, refusing to take her calls, desperate to distance himself from any further scandal. Rachel's life imploded. The prestigious job she loved vanished overnight, a casualty of the corporate restructuring following Klaus's disgrace. The glamorous future she thought she had secured by trading in our marriage turned out to be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. We finalized our divorce quietly. There was no screaming, no drawn-out courtroom battles. The fight had been entirely drained out of her. When we met to sign the final papers, she looked exhausted, stripped of the glossy, honey-dipped veneer she used to wear. She apologized, genuinely and deeply, but an apology doesn't rebuild a burned house. I accepted it, and I walked away. The only unresolved piece of the wreckage was the baby. I had tracked the dates. I knew when Rachel and I had last been intimate, and I knew when her late-night meetings with Klaus had begun. I suspected the truth long before the doctors confirmed it, but when the DNA results finally came back, the paper simply proved what I already felt in my gut. Daniel was mine. He was born in late April, entirely innocent of the corporate espionage and broken vows that preceded him. Because Rachel was unemployed and financially unstable, and because I had a spotless record and a quiet, stable life, I was granted primary physical custody. Sometimes I look at Daniel sleeping in his crib. He has Rachel's eyes, but he has my mother's jaw. He has no idea yet how complicated the story of his family is. He doesn't know about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, or the German insults thrown across a high-end steakhouse. One day, when he is old enough, I will tell him all of it. I will tell him about the grandfather who made mistakes but tried to fix them, and the mother who lost her way. Most importantly, I will tell him about his grandmother, Carol Vance, who taught me the greatest lesson I will ever pass down to him. The most powerful thing a person can do in an impossible situation is simply refuse to be reduced by it. People look at my life now and ask how I stayed so calm while my world was actively being dismantled by the people I trusted most. The truth is, I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because I knew something they didn't. Rachel traded our real life for the illusion of a better one. Klaus traded his integrity for the illusion of power. They were playing a game they thought they controlled, entirely unaware of the board they were standing on. I didn't take the Brenner millions. I didn't want the company. I took the truth, my dignity, and my son. The night my wife sat across from me and tried to hand my life away like leftover takeout, she thought I was a fool. She didn't know I spoke German. She didn't know I knew her secrets. But the biggest thing she didn't know, the thing that allowed me to sit there, sip my wine and smile, was that I had already won.